I watched the recent Joe Rogan podcast with Quentin Tarantino, where Joe brought up the portrayal of Bruce Lee in Tarantino's movie, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I'll just repeat that for the benefit of Chael Sonnen, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. In the podcast, Tarantino expresses some opinions about Bruce and manages to contradict his own script, but that's another story. What I want to talk about is Chael again saying Bruce couldn't fight. The phrase Chael used was, "That guy couldn't fight a lick." Anyway, so rather than just base my response on this one podcast, I thought I would just check to see if Chael had said anything like this before, and I find another video of Chael driving in his car where he says the same thing, that Bruce couldn't fight. However, this time Chael adds, you don't see anyone in the cage doing a move and saying they learned that from Bruce Lee. Well, Chael, there's a very good reason for that. The UFC and other organisations have rules. Bruce Lee taught strikes to the eyes, illegal in the UFC. Bruce Lee taught strikes to the groin, illegal in the UFC. You can't do small joint manipulation in the UFC. And I've never seen anyone in the UFC grab someone by the throat and apply pressure to the windpipe, so I'm guessing that's not legal either. I love the UFC, and I'm not knocking UFC, but that's a sport with rules and a referee. As for UFC fighters saying they didn't learn moves from Bruce Lee, I assume Chael means by imitation. Well, that doesn't mean that in the UFC we don't see strikes that Bruce Lee performed. For example, in Way of the Dragon, we see Bruce perform an oblique kick in his classic fight with Chuck Norris. Also, can we think of other fighters outside MMA that were inspired by Bruce Lee? Sugar Ray Leonard comes to mind immediately. Why would greats like Sugar Ray Leonard take inspiration from a man who couldn't fight? This brings us on to the question of whether Bruce Lee could fight. And unlike Chael, I'm talking about a real fight, not a fight with rules and a referee, but a fight where life could have been in peril. There is an obvious example that has been recounted by witnesses many times and has always been consistent. It's the fight on the set of Enter the Dragon. I'm sure Bruce Lee fans will be familiar with the incident, but Chael Sonnen clearly isn't, so pass this on to him. So one of the extras on Enter the Dragon calls Bruce Lee out during the Hong Kong filming, and so Bruce invites him down. By all accounts, this guy is bigger than Bruce. The witnesses claim this fight lasted seconds, with Bruce arm-locking the guy and smashing him in the face. This isn't Los Angeles, Chael, this was Hong Kong. Also, anyone who says Bruce couldn't fight or didn't have real fights ignores the reason why Bruce was sent to America in the first place, because as a teenager he was involved with street fighting gangs, and by all accounts these were brutal affairs. The final thing I want to say about this to Chael is that there were really three Bruce Lees. There was the Bruce Lee before the Wong Jackman fight, and there was the Bruce Lee after the Wong Jackman fight when he trained his cardio a lot more. Then we have Bruce after he recovered from his back injury and prior to Enter the Dragon. Bruce certainly evolved as an athlete. You can see this from his physique, and the fight on the set of Enter the Dragon was perhaps not even Bruce at his peak, as he was certainly having health problems during this time. In summary, maybe Chael is just trolling and being controversial for clicks, and he's triggering people for fun and attention. Or maybe Chael only knows the UFC and the sport of martial arts and doesn't appreciate the difference between that and the fights Bruce Lee did have. Who knows? This is just my reaction to what Chael is saying. There is one difference though. I'll say what I've got to say to Chael's face. Chael isn't saying Bruce can't fight to his face. To me, that's disrespectful. There are undoubtedly many myths about Bruce Lee, but it's certainly not a myth that Bruce Lee knew how to fight and did engage in real fights. Thank you for listening. Just for purposes of clarification, when I mentioned earlier grabbing people by the throat and applying pressure to the windpipe, I'm referring to finger grip pressure, not the guillotine or other forms of choke. The reason I mentioned this was because of an article many years ago where Bruce Lee competing UFC was discussed, and it was specifically mentioned you'd have to ban Bruce from using his finger grip, which he had developed with a custom-made weight machine.